Rhaenys Targaryen PIC. The heavy oak door of Rhaenys' bedchamber clicked shut, instantly muffling the distant, echoing roar of the great hall. Cregan leaned his broad shoulders against the wood, letting out a long, slow exhale. Across the room, Rhaenys walked toward the blazing hearth. The firelight danced across the dark, curling waves of her hair and the rich olive tone of her skin, turning her into a living flame. She poured 2 goblets of dark Dornish wine, her movements fluid and precise, but her hands trembled just slightly, betraying the hunger she tried to hide. She turned, handing him a goblet. Cregan took it, his thick fingers deliberately brushing against hers. He did not drink. His storm-gray eyes locked entirely on her, drinking in every inch. "I missed your warmth," Rhaenys said softly, setting her own goblet aside. Her voice was low, laced with need. She closed the distance, stepping fully into his personal space. She had to tilt her head up to meet his gaze, her dark, calculating eyes softening with raw desire. "Winterfell was far too cold while you were away." Cregan set his goblet down on a nearby chest without taking a sip. His jaw tightened, the iron control he maintained in the training yards and the great hall beginning to fracture at the edges. "And I missed yours," he murmured, his voice dropping to a deep, husky whisper that vibrated through her. The ice and the bogs had nothing on this. Before she could respond, Rhaenys rose onto her toes and crashed her lips against his. The kiss was immediate, desperate, a collision of fire and frost, survival and aching need. She tasted of dark wine and smoldering embers. Cregan groaned low in his throat, one large hand sliding to the small of her back, pulling her flush against his solid frame. Their mouths moved together hungrily, tongues dancing, teeth grazing. Rhaenys' hands roamed over pelts over them, tucking Rhaenys against his chest. Her head rested over his heart, one leg thrown over his. She traced idle patterns across his ribs. He massaged her wrists and shoulders with more oil, whispering praises and soft kisses until she sighed in perfect contentment. He kissed the top of her head, arm wrapped securely around her waist, holding her tight against the cold of the world outside. They did not know what their parents were planning in the deeper chambers of the keep, nor did they care about the politics of the realm. As the fire burned low in the hearth, tangling the shadows of the dire wolf and the dragon against the stone walls, their bond was forged entirely on their own terms, deeper, hotter, more unbreakable than before. Let the dead march and let the south bleed. In the freezing dark of the long winter, they would face the end of the world together, bodies spent, hearts full, souls forever entwined in fire and frost. Chapter 112. The Shadow and the SCA. The morning after the return to Winterfell, the atmosphere within the private family dining chamber was remarkably quiet. There was no boastful shouting or chaotic energy. The younger children, Arya, Rickard, and Alaric, ate their porridge and thick-cut bacon with a subdued, focused intensity. At the far end of the heavy oak table, Sansa sat beside Rhaenys. Sansa was delicately buttering a piece of fresh bread, her violet eyes occasionally darting toward the adults to gauge the mood. Rhaenys reached across the table to grab a heavy silver pitcher of hot spiced cider. As she extended her arm, the sleeve of her dark wool tunic slid back a few inches. Sansa paused, her butter knife hovering in the air. Around Rhaenys' wrists were distinct, dark red bands of bruising. They were perfectly uniform, wrapping entirely around the delicate skin, resembling the harsh friction burns of thick leather cord or rope. Sansa leaned in close, her brow furrowing in genuine, innocent concern. "Rhaenys," she whispered quietly, not wanting to draw the attention of the table. "Your wrists. What happened?" Rhaenys froze. She glanced down at her exposed arm, a sudden, extremely rare flush of color rising to her olive cheeks. She immediately pulled her sleeve down, yanking the fabric tight over her wrists. "It is nothing, Sansa," Rhaenys whispered back, her voice tight and uncharacteristically flustered. "Just a mishap with some heavy rigging. We will talk about it later." "But they look like they were tied," Sansa pressed, her voice full of sweet, uncomprehending sympathy. "You should have Maester Luwin look at them, they might blister." "Sansa, please," Rhaenys shushed her, giving the younger girl a sharp, definitive look that ended the inquiry immediately. At the other side of the table, Cregan was casually slicing a piece of roasted fowl. He possessed the hearing of a trained hunter, augmented by the latent awareness of the Force. He had heard every word of the whispered exchange. Cregan picked up his goblet of dark northern ale. He took a slow, deliberate sip, looking directly at Rhaenys over the rim of the cup. A distinct, entirely unapologetic smirk touched the corner of his lips. Rhaenys caught the look. Her dark eyes narrowed into a fierce, lethal glare that promised violent retribution the moment they were alone. Beneath the table, she kicked him sharply in the shin. Cregan didn't flinch. He merely took another sip of his ale, his smirk widening slightly, entirely satisfied with himself. At the head of the table, Eddard Stark wiped his mouth with a linen cloth and set his tankard down. The simple, dull thud of the wood commanded the immediate attention of the room. The quiet chatter around the table ceased. Ned looked down the length of the table, his gray eyes settling on Cregan and Rhaenys. Ned looked at Elia and Ashera, who gave brief, confirming nods, before looking back to his heir. In exactly 1 moon's turn, Ned stated, Cregan and Rhaenys will be married in the Godswood. Sansa gasped, a bright, delighted smile breaking across her face. Arya blinked, looking between her older brother and the Dornish princess, trying to calculate the tactical advantages of the match. Ricard and Alaric simply nodded. To them, it made perfect, logical sense. I will send letters to the High Lords of the North today, Ned continued. I want it to be a small wedding. No grand southern tourneys, no wasted excess. Just the lords of our lands, to witness the binding of the direwolf and the dragon before the winter falls. Ned paused, his gaze sweeping over the gathered family. Are there any objections? The room was silent, though the silence carried a distinct, heavy weight at the high table. Elia Martell did not speak. She simply picked up her silver butter knife and turned her dark eyes toward Cregan. She heard the earlier conversation between Sansa and Rhaenys. She knew exactly what those marks were. She gave Cregan a single, sharp, unblinking Dornish glare. A silent, lethal promise that if he ever truly hurt her daughter, she would not hesitate to poison his ale. Cregan caught the look. The arrogant smirk from earlier vanished instantly. He respectfully averted his eyes, swallowed hard, and sat up a little straighter in his heavy oak chair. Beside them, Ned and Ashera continued to cut their roasted fowl with meticulous, synchronized precision. They had both caught the whispered exchange, the bruised wrists, and the lethal maternal threat, yet neither of them acknowledged a single detail. They maintained an impenetrable, stoic facade, entirely content to let the new generation navigate their own dangerous waters without parental interference. Cregan looked back at Rhaenys. The fierce, lethal glare she had worn moments ago had completely melted away, replaced by a quiet intensity that anchored the very air between them. They did not need to speak. No objections, father, Cregan said firmly. Good, Ned said. He pushed his chair back and stood up. Then we have much to prepare. Eat your fill. The training yards await. Later that evening, after the chaotic logistics of managing the encamped northern army had finally quieted down, Ned retreated to the secure quiet of his solar. The heavy ironwood door was locked. The fire in the hearth snapped and hissed. Ned sat behind his desk, surrounded by stacks of blank parchment, inkwells, and the heavy direwolf seal of his house. Ashera and Elia sat in the heavy chairs near the fire, reviewing the latest supply ledgers from White Harbor. The three of them worked in a comfortable, focused silence. Ned pulled a fresh sheet of heavy vellum toward him. He dipped his quill. He was writing to King Robert. Robert, the zealots broke themselves upon the stones of the neck. The north remains untouched, and the survivors have been sent back south. The faith militant is no more. However, the nuisance of the faith is not the reason for this letter. I am invoking my right as a warden of the realm to petition the Iron Throne. I ask you to summon a Grand Council in King's Landing, to be held in exactly 3 moons. Issue royal commands to Tywin Lannister, Mace Tyrell, Doran Martell, Stannis Baratheon, Hoster Tully, and Jon Arryn. Every Lord Paramount must be present in the throne room. I have secured something in the deep north that the entire realm must see. It concerns the absolute survival of the 7 kingdoms. I will bring it to the capital in 3 moons. Ensure the lords are there, Robert. Do not accept their excuses. Ned. Ned sanded the ink and folded the heavy vellum, sealing it with a large pool of dark gray wax. He stamped the snarling direwolf firmly into the center. He will do it, Ashera noted quietly, looking up from her ledgers. Robert will complain about the logistics, but if you tell him it concerns the survival of the realm, he will drag Tywin Lannister to the capital by his collar if he must. Tywin will hate it, Elia murmured, a faint smile touching her lips. Being commanded to travel for a northern announcement. He will assume Ned is plotting for more power. Let him assume, Ned said flatly. When the box is opened, his political games will turn to ash. Ned set the king's letter aside and pulled a stack of smaller parchments forward. He began drafting the wedding invitations for the northern lords. It was quick, pragmatic work. He did not ask for gifts or grand retinues. He simply stated the date and the location. In a moon's time, the Stark line would be formally secured. When the last wedding letter was sealed, Ned stood up and walked to the heavy oak door. He opened it slightly, looking at the wolf guard stationed in the corridor. Find Jon, Arthur Dayne, and Anna, Ned commanded. Bring them here immediately. The guard bowed and hurried off down the stone hall. Ned closed the door and returned to his desk, leaning his knuckles against the wood. 10 minutes later, a heavy knock sounded. Ned opened the door. Jon, Arthur, and Anna stepped into the solar. Jon wore his standard dark gray leathers, looking solemn and alert. Arthur moved with his usual fluid, relaxed grace, while Anna Lyanna looked sharp and restless, clearly eager for a task that did not involve drilling recruits in the yard. Wait at the end of the corridor, Ned instructed the wolf guard outside. No one approaches this door. Ned shut the door and threw the heavy iron bolt. He turned to face the 3 greatest warriors in the north. We have a situation across the narrow sea, Ned began, walking to the map table and gesturing for them to gather around. Ashera and Elia have been monitoring Pentos through the glass candles. Viserys Targaryen is currently hosted by Magister Illyrio Mopatis. Anna crossed her arms, her gray eyes narrowing. The beggar king. Is he trying to buy a Sellsword company? Worse, Elia answered from her chair near the fire. He is trying to buy a Dothraki horde. He is negotiating with Khal Drogo. In exchange for 40,000 riders, Viserys intends to sell Daenerys to the Khal. Jon's jaw tightened. She is of Sansa's age. She is 17, and she is entirely innocent of her father's madness, Ned agreed grimly. Viserys is a volatile, cruel fool. If he hands her to the Dothraki, she will be subjected to unspeakable horrors. We cannot allow Targaryen blood to be sold like cattle to a warlord. I intend to extract her. Arthur Dayne did not blink. His violet eyes were fixed on the map of Pentos. Illyrio's manse will be heavily guarded, Ned. He employs unsullied and seasoned freeriders. A large force will start a war in the free cities. Which is why we are not sending a large force, Ned said, looking directly at his old friend. I am sending you, and Jon. Jon looked up, his gray eyes sharpening. You are a ghost, Jon, Ned explained, his voice entirely pragmatic. Your control over the Force allows you to mask your signature. You can slip through shadows and bypass heavily armed patrols without drawing a blade. Arthur will be your Anvil. If the extraction goes wrong, if you are discovered, Arthur will draw the attention of the guards and hold the line while you get the girl out. I can do it, father, Jon said immediately, his voice completely devoid of hesitation. I am going with them, Anna stated flatly. Ned looked at his sister. She was leaning over the table, her jaw set in an unyielding line. Anna interrupted, her gray eyes turning hard as iron. A young girl being sold to a warlord because the men in her family want an army or a crown. I know exactly how that feels, Ned. The unspoken weight of Robert Baratheon and Rhaegar Targaryen hung heavily in the quiet solar. No girl should be a pawn for a king's ambition, Anna continued, her voice brokering no argument. You need an enforcer. If Arthur gets bogged down fighting Unsullied, Jon cannot protect the girl and fight his way to the docks at the same time. I am going. Ned held her gaze for a long moment. He knew that tone. When Lyanna Stark made up her mind, mountains could not move her. Furthermore, her tactical assessment was completely correct. They needed a third blade to secure the escape route. Ned nodded slowly. Very well. You will join the extraction. Ned turned back to the map, tapping the port of White Harbor. I will send a raven to Lord Wyman Manderley tonight. The Winter's Lance is currently docked there. He will provision it for a rapid voyage. You will take 10 trusted men of the Wolf Guard to crew the ship. No outsiders. The girl's identity will not leave the hull of that ship. And once we have the girl? Arthur asked smoothly. We cannot bring her back to Winterfell. Not while the Northern Lords are gathered for the wedding. Someone might recognize her features. The silver hair and violet eyes are difficult to hide. You will not bring her to Winterfell, Ned confirmed. Ned then said, The moment she is aboard the Winter's Lance, dye her hair dark brown. Tell her to keep her head down. Ned handed the second vial directly to Arthur. You are the most famous knight in Westeros, Arthur, Ned noted dryly. Dye your hair. Keep your eyes lowered. You are no longer the sword of the morning. For this journey, you are just a grumpy, aging northern sellsword. Ned then tossed Jon a heavy leather pouch that clinked with raw, uncut northern silver and polished glass gems. The force will hide you from the guards, Ned advised pragmatically. But if a dock worker or a servant sees you, do not fight them. Essosi loyalty is easily bought. By their silence. You will not sail back to White Harbor, Ned concluded. You will sail around the Stepstones, up the western coast of Westeros, and make landfall at Sea Dragon Point. Keep the girl hidden. Keep her safe. Do not ride for Winterfell until I send a raven expressly calling for you. Understand? Understood. Jon, Arthur, and Anna replied in unison. The wedding is in a moon, Ned said, his tone carrying the heavy weight of the ticking clock. The Grand Council in King's Landing is in 3. The board is moving quickly. Get in, get the girl, and vanish. Consider it done, Ned, Arthur said quietly, offering a respectful nod. Leave at first light, Ned ordered. Take what you need from the armory. The next morning, the courtyard of Winterfell was a chaotic symphony of ringing hammers and shouting soldiers as the gathered northern lords prepared their retinues to either return to their keeps or remain for the coming wedding. Amidst the noise, a small, unassuming party prepared to depart through the east gate. A single, covered wooden cart was hitched to 2 sturdy draft horses. It was loaded with heavy provisions, salted beef, hardtack, and thick wool blankets, enough to sustain a fast ride to White Harbor. Jon tightened the leather straps on his saddle, his face solemn. He wore no identifying sigils, only plain, high-quality dark gray leathers and a heavy hooded cloak. Beside him, Ghost sat silently in the snow. As much as Jon relied on the deep bond he shared with the massive white direwolf, taking the beast across the narrow sea was a tactical impossibility. A giant direwolf with red eyes walking through the streets of Pentos would instantly draw the attention of every spy, merchant, and guard in the city, destroying any hope of a stealth extraction. Jon knelt in the freezing mud, bringing himself eye level with the wolf. He buried his bare hands in the thick white fur and projected a firm, calming pulse through the force. Stay, Jon communicated silently through their bond, pressing the quiet command to guard the pack until his return. Ghost let out a low, reluctant whine, but he sat back on his haunches, accepting the order. Anna swung up onto her roan courser, adjusting her sword belt. She looked energized, the prospect of action pulling her out of the routine of castle life. She glanced down at Ghost, who was watching Jon intently. He doesn't like being left behind, Anna noted quietly, adjusting her reins. He knows why he has to stay, Jon replied, pulling himself up into his saddle. Arthur Dayne sat atop a steady gray gelding, looking entirely relaxed. His silver-streaked hair was already stained a dull, dirty brown, and Dawn was securely wrapped in thick leather to hide its iconic, pale blade. Ned walked out into the freezing morning air to see them off. He didn't offer a grand speech. He simply walked up to Jon's horse and looked his nephew in the eye. Trust your instincts, Jon, Ned said quietly. The Force will guide your path. Do not force a fight if you can slip past it. I will be a shadow, father, Jon promised. Ned stepped back, looking at Arthur and Anna. May the old gods ride with you. Bring her back safely. Anna offered a sharp, confident grin. We will be drinking ale at Sea Dragon Point before the moon turns, Ned. Arthur gave a brief salute. Yah, he called, nudging his horse forward. The small party rode out through the heavy stone archway of the east gate, the supply cart rattling behind them. They did not look like an elite strike team capable of infiltrating a Magister's fortress. They looked like a simple merchant guard heading for the coast. Ned watched them until they disappeared over the snow-dusted hills, heading east toward the biting winds of the shivering sea. He had deployed his shadows. Now he had to turn his attention north, to the true war gathering in the freezing dark. Chapter 113. The Unseen Wolf. The Wolfswood Road leading east toward the White Knife was hard-packed dirt, dusted with a fresh layer of morning frost. The small northern party moved with absolute, unyielding discipline. They did not ride at a full gallop, that would only exhaust the horses and draw the attention of merchants or patrols, but they maintained a relentless, ground-eating trot. Jon Stark, Anna, and Arthur Dayne rode at the front, their heavy gray cloaks pulled tight against the biting wind coming off the shivering sea. Behind them, 10 trusted men of the Wolfpack rode in formation. 2 drove the sturdy draft horses pulling the single, tarp-covered supply cart, while the other 8 guarded their flanks. By midday, the sun had reached its highest point in the pale gray sky, offering light but very little heat. Arthur Dane raised a gloved hand, signaling a halt. "We rest the horses for half an hour," the master-at-arms commanded quietly. "Water them, check their shoes, and eat your rations." The riders dismounted in a small clearing off the main road, shielded by a dense thicket of ancient sentinel pines. John unbuckled his water skin, taking a slow drink, his gray eyes scanning the tree line. His connection to the force was a steady, quiet hum in the back of his mind. He felt the ambient life of the forest, the slow heartbeat of a sleeping bear in a distant cave, the rapid flutter of a hunting hawk above the canopy. Without Ghost pacing at his side, John's awareness was spread wider, compensating for the direwolf's absence. Anna stretched her legs, pulling a piece of hardtack and a strip of salted beef from her saddlebag. "We are making good time," she noted pragmatically, chewing the tough meat. "If the weather holds, it will take us 2 days to reach the docks of White Harbor." "Wyman Manderley expects us," Arthur replied, loosening the girth on his gray gelding. "The winter's lance will be fully provisioned. We board, we sail, and we vanish into the narrow sea." Toward the rear of the clearing, a wolf guard named Castle walked to the back of the supply cart. He was unlacing the heavy ropes that tied the thick canvas tarp down over the cargo. Castle threw the tarp back. He reached into the dark interior of the cart, reaching past a barrel of dried apples. Suddenly, the guard froze. His trained eyes caught a subtle, unnatural shift in the shadows between a stack of heavy wool blankets and a crate of iron spearheads. With the lethal, drilled reflexes of Ned Stark's vanguard, Castle drew his castle-forged longsword in a fraction of a second. The scrape of steel ringing out in the quiet clearing caused every man in the party to instantly drop their rations and reach for their hilts. Movement in the cart. Castle barked sharply, keeping his blade leveled at the dark gap between the crates. "Come out, slowly, with your hands empty, or I will run you through." John, Anna, and Arthur dropped what they were holding and moved swiftly to the back of the cart, their hands resting on their pommels. John's brow furrowed in genuine confusion. He reached out with the force, probing the interior of the cart, but he felt absolutely nothing. No heartbeat, no sense of life, no malice. It was as empty as a stone. The heavy wool blankets near the back of the cart suddenly shifted. A small, mud-stained figure pushed the blankets aside and slowly stood up, brushing oat flakes and dust off a dark leather tunic. Castle lowered his sword a fraction of an inch, his mouth falling open in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. John stared. The breath left his lungs. "Arya?" John asked, his voice cracking with absolute shock. "What are you doing here?" Standing in the back of the supply cart was 15-year-old Arya Stark. She had dirt smudged across her nose, a stray piece of straw stuck in her tangled dark hair, and she was wearing riding leathers. She carried a small, finely balanced steel dagger on her belt. For a brief second, Arya looked incredibly sheepish, shifting her weight from foot to foot under the heavy, stunned glares of the 3 deadliest warriors in the north. "Get down from the cart, Arya," Anna commanded, her voice dangerously calm, completely devoid of its usual amusement. "Now, before I drag you down by your ear." Arya didn't argue. She scrambled nimbly over the wooden tailgate and hopped down onto the frozen dirt, immediately crossing her arms and lifting her chin defensively. "Explain yourself," Arthur Dane said. The master-at-arms did not yell, but his violet eyes were cold, assessing the grave risk she had just taken. Arya admitted, looking between John and Anna. "I heard you were taking a ship across the narrow sea. To Essos." Arya's gray eyes flashed with defiant fire. "I want to see Essos. I want to see the free cities and the Bravusi swordsmen. But I knew Father would never allow me to go. He would just tell me to stay in the yard and practice my footwork. So, I packed my own bag and I snuck into the cart before dawn." John slowly shook his head, running a hand through his dark hair. The sheer absurdity of the situation. "I didn't feel you," John murmured, staring at his younger sister as if he were seeing her for the first time. "I was projecting my awareness across the entire courtyard before we left. I have been scanning the road for hours. You were sitting less than 20 feet behind me, and I felt nothing." John let out a breathless, disbelieving laugh. "You are even more of a ghost than me, Arya." Arya puffed her chest out, a fiercely proud grin breaking across her dirty face. "Who do you think you were talking to?" she boasted, tapping her chest. "I'm a wolf. I learned how to mask my breathing and hide my presence better than you. I can sneak into anyone's room in Winterfell and no one, not even father, will notice I'm there until I want them to." Anna crossed her arms, her sharp gray eyes narrowing. She looked at Arya, and for a fleeting moment, she saw an exact mirror of herself. A wild, restless wolf maid who hated being told to sit still while the men rode off to see the world. But Anna was no longer a rebellious girl. "It is an impressive display of the Force, Arya," Anna conceded coldly. "But this is not a game in the Godswood. We are not sailing to Essos to buy silks. We are sailing into a heavily guarded Magister's manse to steal a highly valuable hostage. If we are caught, we will be killed. It is no place for a child." Jon turned to Arthur Dayne. As the master-at-arms and the most experienced commander present, the final decision fell to him. "What should we do, uncle?" Jon asked quietly. "Do we turn back? Or do I take one of the horses and ride her back to the gates?" Arthur Dayne evaluated the harsh truth of their situation. He looked at the sun. He looked at the road stretching back toward Winterfell. "We have been riding hard since first light," Arthur stated, his tone purely pragmatic. "If we turn back now, we lose a full day, and we risk missing the tide window Lord Manderley has prepared for the winter's lance. Time is a luxury we do not have. Magister Illyrio could sell the Targaryen girl to the Dothraki at any moment." Arthur looked at Jon. "I will not split our forces. If I send you back with her, I lose my best shadow. If I send a regular guardsman, I risk her safety on the road. The forests are quiet, but they are not empty." Arthur looked back at Arya. The girl held her breath, waiting for the verdict. "She is a Stark," Arthur concluded calmly. "She has been trained in the yard, and she clearly possesses an exceptional natural mastery of stealth. We have come a long way from Winterfell. Let us just take her with us." "Yes," Arya cheered, throwing her arms up in absolute victory, executing a flawless, celebratory backflip in the dirt. Jon sighed, shaking his head, but a small, undeniable smile touched the corners of his mouth. Anna let out a sharp, relenting breath, her strict posture relaxing as she failed to hide her own amusement. It was impossible to stay angry at the girl's sheer, unadulterated joy. "Fine," Anna relented, pointing a stern finger at Arya. "But you listen to me, little wolf. When we reach Pentos, you do exactly as Arthur tells you. You do not wander off. You do not pick fights. You stay in the shadows." "I am the shadows," Arya promised fiercely. "Give her some salted beef," Arthur instructed Castle, "and unhitch one of the spare remounts from the back of the cart. She rides in the saddle from here on out. I will not have my vanguard slowed down by a girl hiding in a pile of blankets." Arya happily accepted a thick piece of salted meat and a water skin, practically vibrating with excitement as the guardsmen saddled a sturdy, nimble gray pony for her. They finished their quick meal in the freezing air, the tension of the discovery replaced by the focused, quiet rhythm of the road. They mounted up and continued their journey eastward, the small party now numbering one extra, highly lethal shadow. Meanwhile, high in the ancient, stone-walled corridors of Winterfell, a very different kind of tension was brewing. The afternoon meals in the Great Hall had concluded. Ashera Stark walked briskly through the covered stone bridges connecting the armory to the Great Keep. She wore a simple, elegant dress of dark purple wool, her face set in a look of mild, growing annoyance. She stopped near the entrance of the main training yard. The yard was currently occupied by a dozen spearmen running drills, and young Alaric sparring with a wooden practice sword against a master-at-arms. Ashera caught the eye of Jory Castle, the captain of the household guard. "Jory, have you seen Arya?" Jory paused, resting his hand on his sword belt. He frowned, thinking back over the morning's busy schedule. "Not since breakfast, my lady. I assumed she was in the Godswood with her direwolf, or perhaps in the glasshouses. She is not in the Godswood, and Nymeria is currently pacing the kennels, highly agitated," Ashera replied, her violet eyes narrowing slightly. "She missed the midday meal entirely. Arya never misses a meal unless she is actively avoiding punishment." Jory's posture immediately straightened, recognizing the subtle shift in the Lady of Winterfell's tone. A missing Stark child was not a matter to be taken lightly. "I will organize a search, my lady. We will check the libraries, the crypts, and the broken tower. Take 10 men," Ashera ordered smoothly. Sweep the castle. If she is hiding in the lower levels, find her. And send 2 men down to the winter town, just in case she decided to go watching the armorers at the forges. At once, my lady. Jory bowed, immediately turning to bark orders at his men. Ashera waited for nearly an hour. She checked the sewing rooms, the kitchens, and even Eliah's chambers, but the fierce young wolf was nowhere to be found. When Jory finally returned to the great keep, he looked visibly pale and terrified, sweating despite the freezing cold. Nothing, Lady Ashera, Jory reported, his voice trembling slightly as he kept it low. We swept the castle from the highest towers to the crypts. We checked the winter town. We are currently dragging the moat, my lady, and I have men interrogating the cooks. No one has seen her since the sun rose. Jory swallowed hard, glancing nervously toward the warden's solar. If we do not find her before Lord Stark realizes she is gone, I fear he will mount my head on the spikes above the hunter's gate. The mild annoyance in Ashera's chest hardened into a cold, sharp spike of maternal concern. She did not panic. She was the spymaster of the North, trained to evaluate threats calmly. But the disappearance of a daughter within the walls of her own heavily guarded fortress was a grave concern. Ashera turned on her heel and walked directly toward the warden's solar. The heavy ironwood door was shut. Ashera didn't bother knocking. She simply pushed the handle and stepped inside. Ned Stark sat behind his desk, reviewing a stack of parchment detailing the grain reserves of the last hearth. He looked up as Ashera entered, immediately reading the tight lines of tension around her eyes. He set his quill down. What is it? Ned asked quietly. Arya is missing, Ashera stated, walking to the desk. She missed the midday meal. Jory and his men have turned the castle upside down and swept the winter town. No one has seen her since dawn. Her direwolf is still here, but the girl has vanished. Ned leaned back in his heavy oak chair. He did not immediately call for the guards or order the gates sealed. He simply crossed his arms, his gray eyes staring blankly at the map on his desk as his mind began to piece it together. Arya was 15. She was fiercely independent, exceptionally skilled in force, and possessed a deeply ingrained resentment for staying behind while others rode to war. Ned thought about the morning's events. The courtyard had been chaotic. Dozens of wagons moving, lords shouting, the army breaking camp. And amidst that chaos, a small, heavily provisioned supply cart had rolled out the east gate, heading for White Harbor, carrying Jon, Arthur, and Anna on a mission to a foreign continent. A faint, knowing smile touched the corners of Ned Stark's mouth. Ashera saw the smile. Her violet eyes flashed with sudden, dangerous indignation. Your daughter has disappeared without a trace, Ned, and you are smiling? I am not smiling at her disappearance, Ashera, Ned replied calmly, entirely unbothered by her glare. I am smiling at her cunning. Ned gestured to the small, ornate wooden box resting on a side table near the hearth. If you wish to know where your daughter is, look to where Jon and the others are. Use the glass candle. Ashera crossed her arms, her patience wearing extremely thin. I am talking about Arya, Ned, and you are telling me to look at Jon and Arthur's rescue mission. I am, Ned insisted smoothly. Why don't you look for them, and then talk to me? Ashera huffed a breath of pure frustration. She turned, walked over to the side table, and opened the wooden box. Inside rested a sharp, twisted pillar of black obsidian, one of the glass candles recovered from Valyria. Ashera placed her hands on either side of the black glass. She closed her eyes, letting her breathing slow, channeling her deep, empathic connection to the Force into the ancient Valyrian artifact. The candle did not burn with fire. It simply began to emit a pale, shadowless light. Distance folded. The stone walls of the solar melted away, replaced by the rushing, freezing wind and the hard-packed dirt of the Wolfswood Road. Ashera's vision in the glass locked onto the living presence of Jon and Anna. She saw them riding at a steady, ground-eating trot. She saw Arthur Dayne riding beside them. She saw the heavy supply cart and the flanking guardsmen rattling behind them. And then, she saw the small, sturdy gray pony riding perfectly in formation between Jon and Anna. Sitting atop the pony, wrapped in a thick fur cloak, eating a piece of dried apple and happily chatting with her older brother, was Arya Stark. The vision violently collapsed. Back in the solar, the pale light of the obsidian candle winked out. Ashera stood perfectly still for 3 seconds. Her hands slowly balled into tight fists at her sides. That little terror, Ashera whispered. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a cold, absolute fury that made the flames in the hearth physically dim. She snuck into their supply cart. She bypassed outer guards, masked her presence, and smuggled herself onto a rescue mission to Essos. Ned picked his quill back up, casually dipping it into the inkwell. She is highly motivated, and her stealth is flawless. You must admit, it is a rather impressive feat of stealth for a girl of 15. Ashera turned slowly, pinning the Warden of the North with a glare that could have melted wall. Ashera, her voice deadly calm, promised, I am going to lock her in the deepest, darkest level of the crypts. I am going to make her scrub the floors of the kennels with a small brush until she is 30 years old. Ned wisely chose not to argue. He simply kept his eyes on his ledger. A fitting punishment. When she returns. When she returns? Ashera agreed, her violet eyes narrowing into slits. She made a silent, unbreakable maternal vow to herself, fully intent on handing the fierce young wolf a new ass the very second she set foot back in the Winterfell courtyard. She turned on her heel and marched out of the solar, the heavy ironwood door slamming shut behind her with a resounding crack. 100 leagues to the east, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows through the dense trunks of the wolfswood. Arya was riding her pony, thoroughly enjoying the crisp air and the thrill of the open road. When it hit her, it wasn't the wind. It was a sudden, absolute chill that ripped straight down her spine, bypassing her thick wool cloak entirely. The freezing sensation settled deep in the marrow of her bones, causing her to violently shudder, her teeth clacking together in a sharp clack. Anna, riding beside her, noticed the sudden flinch. She pulled back slightly on her reins, looking at the girl with a practiced, assessing eye. What happened? Anna asked, her hand instinctively dropping near her sword. Are you cold? Did you see something in the trees? Arya shook her head, rubbing her arms vigorously to dispel the goosebumps. She looked around, but the woods were completely empty and silent. No, Arya muttered, her gray eyes wide and slightly unnerved. Nothing in the trees. I just had a really ominous feeling, like a shadow walked over my grave. Jon, riding a few paces ahead, did not stop his horse. He didn't even turn his head. He simply kept his eyes fixed on the road leading toward White Harbor. Jon, his voice entirely deadpan, echoing with dry, pragmatic northern humor. Maybe its mother just found out you are missing, and she is currently planning exactly how she intends to punish you when we get back. Arya swallowed hard, the thrilling romance of her grand adventure suddenly taking a severe, terrifying hit. The Magisters of Pentos, the Dothraki hordes, and the dangerous mercenaries of Essos didn't frighten her in the slightest. But Lady Ashera Stark waiting in the courtyard with a fierce look on her face? That was a threat that made the young wolf truly fear for her life. Arya pulled her fur cloak a little tighter around her neck, suddenly very eager to put the narrow sea between herself and Winterfell. Chapter 114 Decrees and Shadows. The scent of pine and frozen earth gave way to the sharp, biting tang of salt and gutted fish. After 2 days of relentless, hard riding, the small northern party crested a final ridge, and the sprawling port city of White Harbor opened up before them. The city was a testament to the Manderleys' wealth and northern discipline. Clean, well-fortified, and completely devoid of the chaotic sprawl that plagued southern ports. They did not ride through the main city gates. Following Ned Stark's precise instructions, they took a secondary, heavily guarded perimeter road that led directly to the military docks of the Wolf's Den. Lord Wyman Manderley was not a man who failed his warden. True to his orders, a sleek, narrow-hulled ship sat at the end of a private pier. The Winter's Lance was built for speed and evasion, not for hauling cargo. Its sails were tightly furled, and its deck was a picture of silent, rigorous order. Jon dismounted, handing the reins of his horse to one of the 10 Wolfguard who had accompanied them. He looked up at the deck of the ship. Then Wolf Pack members loaded the provisions. Anna swung down from her courser, immediately grabbing the heavy leather bags from the supply cart. She turned to Arya. Inside the ship. Now, Anna ordered, pointing to the gangplank. Arya grabbed her small pack and hurried up the wooden plank, eager to secure her place on the vessel. Anna followed her, pulling the heavy oak door of the captain's cabin shut behind them to brief the girl on ship rules. On the deck, Arthur Dayne stood casually near the mainmast. Jon walked up the gangplank, his gray cloak pulled tight against the sea wind. He looked at Arthur, giving a brief, satisfied nod. The horses are stabled, Jon reported. The Wolfguard are aboard, and the captain has given the signal. The tide is turning. Then we sail, Arthur said quietly. Within minutes, the heavy mooring lines were cast off. The Winter's Lance slipped away from the stone piers of White Harbor, its narrow hull cutting cleanly through the freezing, gray waters of the Bight. John stood at the stern, watching the white walls of the city shrink into the distance. They were no longer lords or knights of the north. They were shadows, crossing the poison water to steal a dragon. 1,000 leagues to the south, the air in King's Landing was stifling, smelling of hot garbage, perfume, and political rot. Inside the small council chambers of the Red Keep, the heat of the afternoon sun beat against the northern glass windows. King Robert Baratheon sat at the head of the long oak table. A massive flagon of strong arbor gold sat half-empty at his elbow, and his face was flushed. Around the table sat the men who governed the realm. Jon Arryn, the hand of the king, looked old and exhausted, rubbing his temples as he reviewed a ledger. Stannis Baratheon, the master of ships, sat with his back perfectly straight, his face a mask of grinding, rigid duty. Across from him, Renly Baratheon, the master of laws, wore a pristine green velvet doublet, looking thoroughly bored by the mundane details of governance. Grand Maester Pycelle dozed lightly in his chair. Lord Varys sat with his hands folded in his wide silk sleeves, completely motionless. Peter Baelish, the master of coin, was tapping a quill lightly against a piece of parchment. The fallout from the neck is causing unrest in the capital, Your Grace, Baelish was saying, his voice a smooth, irritating hum that masked the sheer internal agony of his lost gold. The small folk whisper of the 12,000 dead zealots. The Starry September demands the crown formally reprimand Lord Stark for his excessive brutality against the faithful. I do not care about the High Septon's whining little finger, Robert interrupted loudly, his booming voice echoing off the stone walls. He waved a massive, meaty hand dismissively. The fools marched an army to my warden's gates and expected a hug. Ned smashed them as he should have. My head is pounding, and I have heard nothing but weeping sparrows for a fortnight. Fortunate as the outcome may be, Stannis Baratheon interjected, his jaw tight, his posture completely rigid. It is a dangerous precedent, Robert. The Warden of the North repelled an invasion of 50,000 men without informing the Iron Throne or requesting royal aid. He operates as an independent monarch. Renly scoffed lightly, brushing a speck of dust from his velvet sleeve. Oh, let the wolf freeze in his own den, Stannis. If Lord Stark wishes to dispose of starving zealots without spending our gold, I say we let him. It saves me the tedious work of drafting royal pardons or execution warrants for 50,000 peasants. Before Stannis could grind out a reprimand for his younger brother, the heavy oak doors of the chamber opened. A Kingsguard knight stepped inside, bowing deeply. A raven from Winterfell, Your Grace, the knight announced, stepping forward to place a sealed, heavy vellum scroll on the table directly in front of the king. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Pycelle woke up. Varys tilted his head a fraction of an inch. Baelish stopped tapping his fingers. Stannis and Renly both leaned forward slightly, their attention finally caught. Robert sat forward, his boredom vanishing. He recognized the dark gray wax and the heavy, snarling direwolf stamped into the center. Ned regularly sent letters, but he never used the heavy vellum of the Warden unless it was official. Robert cracked the seal with a thick thumb and unrolled the parchment. His blue eyes scanned the harsh, angular handwriting of his oldest friend. The council waited for the king's booming laugh, expecting another quip about the crushed zealots. Instead, Robert's amusement vanished. A sudden, intense seriousness settled over his heavy features as his brow furrowed. Ned doesn't ask for praise, Robert muttered, his eyes still fixed on the parchment. He looked up, his gaze locking directly onto his hand. Jon, Robert commanded, his voice carrying the absolute, unyielding authority of the Iron Throne. Draft letters to Casterly Rock, Highgarden, Sunspear, and Riverrun. Issue royal commands to Tywin Lannister, Mace Tyrell, Doran Martell, and Hoster Tully. They and their bannermans are to present themselves in the throne room of the Red Keep in exactly 3 moons. The silence in the small council chamber was absolute. Baelish was the first to recover, leaning forward with a look of calculated concern. A grand council, Your Grace? That is a monumental undertaking. The expense of hosting the lords paramount, their lords, their retinues, their guards. A grand council is invoked for matters of succession or absolute crisis. Stannis agreed, his tone rigid and unyielding. To summon them blindly based on a single letter is a slight to their authority and a misuse of royal power. Though it would be quite the spectacle, Renly murmured, a faint, amused smile touching his lips. Tywin Lannister and Mace Tyrell forced to ride the Kingsroad like summoned servants. We would have to host a magnificent tourney to pacify their wounded pride. Robert slowly turned his heavy head to look at his brothers. The look in his blue eyes was hard enough to wipe the smile entirely from Renly's face. I do not need to ask him, Robert growled, slamming his fist onto the table. If Ned Stark tells me something is important, then damn right it is important. He is not like these southern peacocks preening for attention and begging for titles. Robert looked around the table, glaring at his brothers, Pycelle, Baelish, and Varys. Ned rules his lands. He protects my borders. And if he says he has something that concerns the absolute survival of the Seven Kingdoms, I believe him. Your Grace, Varys purred softly, his voice a balm over the king's anger. It is merely that Lord Tywin and Lord Mace might hesitate to make such a long journey without understanding the cause. They are proud men. Robert stood up, grabbing his half-empty flagon of wine. He looked down at the men who thought they ruled his kingdom. I do not care if they hesitate, Robert decreed, his voice echoing with finality. Their king demands it, and they will answer the call. Tell them they have to be present in King's Landing in 3 moons. It is a royal decree. Any man who fails to attend will be answering to my warhammer. Jon Arryn picked up the heavy vellum, his old eyes scanning Ned's words. He understood the gravity of his former ward's tone. It shall be done, Your Grace. The ravens will fly by nightfall. Good, Robert grunted, turning and marching heavily out of the chamber, leaving the council to their whispers. As the heavy oak doors closed, Peter Baelish steepled his fingers, his mind racing through 1,000 different calculations. What could the wolf possibly have found in the freezing wastes that warranted a grand council? Varys remained perfectly still, his dark eyes unreadable. But deep within the spider's mind, a new, highly concerning variable had just been added to the board. Eddard Stark was moving his pieces, and he was not playing the game Varys had prepared for. While the Master of Coin and the Spider calculated their next moves, Grand Maester Pycelle shuffled as swiftly as his frail legs would allow through the corridors of the Red Keep, making a direct line for the Queen's apartments. Cersei Lannister sat near a roaring hearth, a cup of Arbor gold in her hand, listening carefully as the old maester breathlessly recounted every word spoken in the council chamber. And his grace commanded that Lord Tywin be summoned under royal decree. My queen, Pycelle finished, his heavy chains clinking as he bowed his head obsequiously. The king would not be swayed to ask for a reason first. Cersei took a slow sip of her wine, her emerald eyes cold and unimpressed. She thought to herself with supreme, arrogant certainty. Let the wolf drag his northern pride to the capital. He thinks because he butchered a mob of starving peasants, he can now dictate terms to the Iron Throne. When he arrives, my father will put him back in his place. She had absolutely no idea Ned was bringing a walking corpse in an ironwood box. Thank you, Grand Maester. Cersei dismissed him with a careless wave of her hand. Let Lord Stark come. He will find the South is not so easily frightened as a flock of barefoot sparrows. While the lords of the South scrambled to interpret the warden's demands, the true threat of the world marched silently through the freezing dark. Far beyond the wall, the cold was absolute. It was a physical weight, pressing against the lungs and freezing the moisture on a man's breath before it could dissipate into the air. A sleek, heavily reinforced northern cutter, bearing the unadorned black sails of Benjen Stark's coastal fleet, sat anchored in a small, ice-choked cove along the frozen shore. A single longboat had been rowed to the rocky, snow-covered beach. Standing on the shore was a man draped in a heavy cloak of stitched black wool and red silk. Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall, possessed a hard, weathered face and sharp brown eyes. He was surrounded by a dozen hardened free-folk warriors, their spears tipped with dragonglass and bone. Walking toward them across the snow was a single operative of the Wolfguard. The northern soldier wore heavy white furs over dark boiled leather. He moved with the quiet, deliberate discipline of Ned Stark's vanguard. He did not look at the spears pointed at his chest. He stopped 10 paces from Mance Rayder. The Wolfguard operative reached into his furs and produced a sealed leather tube. He tossed it through the freezing air. Mance caught it easily. He cracked the seal, unrolling a thick piece of parchment. There were no pleasantries, no royal titles, and no diplomatic filler. Ned Stark's orders were always brutally direct. Mance, there is a vulnerability on our flank. Craster's Keep. He is offering his newborn sons to the woods in exchange for his own survival. He is not appeasing the walkers. He is supplying them. The White Walkers use the infants to forge their vanguard. This supply line must be cut. Kill Craster. Burn his keep. Take his wives and daughters under your banner and bring them to the safety of your host. If your forces are spread too thin to manage this, inform the operative. Show him the exact coordinates of the keep. I will send a detachment to eradicate the problem myself. Stark. Mance Rayder read the letter twice. His jaw tightened, the muscle sticking in his cheek. Mance knew Craster well. He despised the man. Craster was a vile, incestuous coward who claimed to be a godly man while hiding behind the very monsters that hunted the free folk. Mance had tolerated him in the past solely because Craster's Keep served as a rare, neutral waypoint for ranging parties. But Ned Stark's intelligence presented a new, horrifying reality. If the White Walkers were using the male infants to forge new generals, new officers to lead the army of the dead, then Craster was not just a coward. He was a strategic asset for the enemy. Every son he surrendered was another blade pointing south. Mance rolled the parchment back up and crushed it in his gloved fist. He looked at the Wolfguard operative waiting silently in the snow. Beside him, Tormund Giantsbane had listened as Mance read the cold, brutal order to burn the keep and take the women. Tormund let out a low, impressed whistle, looking at the silent northern operative. Your Lord Stark is a cold bastard, Tormund rumbled approvingly. Sitting in his warm castle, drawing lines on a map, and ordering the deaths of men he's never met just to thin the enemy's herd. I like him. The Northman offered no demands. He simply waited for the response. Lord Stark has a sharp mind, Mance stated, his voice carrying over the howling wind. He is right. A king does not leave an armory intact for his enemy to use. I always knew Craster was a filthy coward, but to breed the very officers that will command the dead against us? We are going to burn that armory to the ground. Mance turned to Tormund. Gather 50 of our best fighters. Tell them to pack provisions for a hard march. We are going to pay Craster a visit. Mance looked back at the Wolfguard operative. Tell Lord Stark the message is received, Mance commanded firmly. He does not need to send his wolves into the deep snow. The free folk will take care of our own refuse. Craster dies tonight, and his fires will be put out permanently. The Wolfguard operative did not speak. He gave a single, sharp nod of acknowledgement. The terms were settled. The alliance held. The northern soldier turned on his heel and walked back to the waiting longboat. He pushed the heavy wooden prow into the freezing surf, climbing aboard and taking up the oars. Mance watched the boat row back toward the waiting cutter. The king beyond the wall pulled his heavy red and black cloak tighter against the biting wind. Ned Stark was securing his southern flank in King's Landing, and he was commanding strikes in the deepest, uncharted regions of the true north. The Warden of the North was playing a terrifyingly precise game of survival across the entire continent, and Mance Rayder found himself highly relieved that they were aiming their spears in the same direction. Move out! Mance roared to his men, turning his back on the sea. We march for Craster's Keep. Chapter 115, The Shadows of Pentos. The narrow sea was entirely devoid of the violent, freezing storms that plagued the waters of the north. As the winter's lance cut southward, the biting wind of the bight slowly gave way to the milder, salty breezes of the narrow channels. They sailed with absolute discipline. There were no sea shanties sung on the deck, no loud orders barked across the bow. It was a phantom ship, running dark and fast across the water. On the eve of their arrival, the massive, sprawling port city of Pentos finally emerged from the sea mist. It was a city built on trade and the staggering wealth of its magisters. High, square brick towers and sprawling manses dominated the hillsides, while the lower docks were a chaotic, tightly packed maze of wooden piers, warehouses, and merchant cogs flying the banners of every free city in Essos. The smell of the city carried over the water long before they docked. A heavy, cloying mixture of roasted spices, stale wine, raw sewage, and cheap perfume. Jon Stark stood at the bow of the ship, his heavy gray cloak pulled tight against the wind. He did not look impressed by the sheer size of the city. He simply watched the harbor patrols and the merchant vessels, his mind analyzing the chaotic movement of the port. Arthur Dayne stood beside him. The master-at-arms wore simple, unadorned leather armor and a plain brown cloak. We do not dock at the grand piers, Arthur instructed the ship's captain, pointing toward a much older, less reputable section of the harbor hidden behind a row of crumbling stone warehouses. Take us into the lower docks. The harbor masters their care only for the weight of the silver, not the names on the ship's registry. The captain gave a sharp hand signal. The crew adjusted the sails, guiding the narrow, dark hull of the Winter's Lance away from the bright lanterns of the main port and slipping quietly into a shadowed berth among the lesser whaling ships and smuggling cogs. Heavy ropes were tossed. The ship was secured. Lower the gangplank, but keep the men aboard, Anna commanded, stepping out of the captain's cabin. She wore her usual boiled leather, her auburn hair tied back tightly. No one leaves this deck without my word. We are not here to drink in their taverns. John turned from the railing and walked toward the center of the deck, where Castle and another seasoned wolfguard named Alan were waiting. Both men had shed their northern colors, dressed instead in the rough, stained tunics and canvas trousers of common deckhands. The city is awake, John told them quietly. You know the target, Magister Illyrio Mopatus. His manse is in the upper city, where the wealthy reside. We need to know what we are walking into. Arthur stepped up, his violet eyes hard and focused. Walk the perimeter of his walls. Do not linger near the gates, and do not look the guards in the eye. Count their numbers, mark their weapons, and note the blind spots in their patrols. When you are finished, find a busy tavern near the docks. Buy cheap wine, keep your heads down and listen. The taverns always know what the magisters are trying to hide. It will be done, Sir Arthur, Castle said, offering a brief nod. Do not draw your blades, Anna added sternly. If a drunken sailor provokes you, you walk away. If the city guard demands coin, pay them. You are shadows tonight. Castle and Alan turned, walking quickly down the wooden gangplank and disappearing into the chaotic, dimly lit maze of the lower docks. With the scouts deployed, the agonizing wait began. Inside the small, wood-paneled captain's cabin, the air grew thick with tension. The small space was illuminated by a single, hooded oil lantern. A rough map of Pentos lay unrolled on the heavy oak table. Arya sat on a wooden crate in the corner, her knees pulled to her chest, absent-mindedly spinning her finely balanced steel dagger between her fingers. She was eager for action, but the suffocating waiting game of true stealth work was beginning to wear on her nerves. They have been gone for 3 hours, Arya muttered, sheathing the dagger with a sharp click, only to draw it again a second later. I could have climbed the Magister's wall and looked through his windows by now. And if you were spotted, you would have doomed the entire mission, and the girl along with it, Anna replied coldly. Not looking up from the whetstone, she was running along the edge of her short sword. Patience, Arya. A shadow does not strike until it knows exactly where the light falls. Arthur sat in a heavy wooden chair, his long legs stretched out before him, his eyes closed. He was not sleeping. He was resting his mind, conserving his energy. John sat cross-legged on the floor near the small hearth. He was meditating. He let the immediate, cramped surroundings of the cabin fade away. He pushed his awareness outward, past the wooden hull of the ship, past the foul-smelling water of the docks, and up into the sprawling, noisy city above. He felt the overwhelming, chaotic noise of 100,000 lives. He felt the sharp flares of anger in the taverns, the dull, heavy exhaustion of the slaves working the docks, and the cold, measured greed of the merchants. It was a suffocating ocean of emotion, entirely lacking the clean, pristine silence of the northern woods. He did not let it overwhelm him. He simply observed the currents, letting the noise wash over his anchor. 2 more hours crawled by in absolute silence. Finally, the heavy oak door of the cabin groaned open. Castle and Alan stepped inside. They smelled strongly of cheap, sour wine and stale sweat. Castle carefully bolted the door behind them while Alan wiped the grime from his face. John opened his eyes, rising fluidly to his feet. Arthur opened his eyes and leaned forward, the casual posture vanishing instantly. Anna set her whetstone aside. Report, Arthur commanded simply. Castle walked to the table, pointing a thick, calloused finger at the upper section of the map. The manse is a fortress, sir. It sits on a high hill overlooking the bay. The perimeter is enclosed by a brick wall, nearly 15 feet high. The Magister had broken glass and sharp iron embedded into the top layer of mortar to stop climbers. Gates? John asked. Heavy wrought iron, Alan answered. And the men guarding them are not ordinary sellswords. They wear spiked bronze caps and carry tall spears. They stand completely motionless. I watched a drunken merchant stumble into one of them, and the guard didn't even blink. He just shoved the man into the dirt with the butt of his spear and returned to his stance. Arthur's jaw tightened. Unsullied. Slave soldiers from Astapor. They do not feel pain, they do not break ranks, and they cannot be bribed. Magister Illyrio must have vast wealth to purchase Unsullied merely to guard his front door. There are Sellswords as well, Castle added quickly. A few dozen regular mercenaries walking the perimeter walls and guarding the outer gardens. They are typical free riders, lazy, poorly disciplined, and far more interested in chatting with the servant girls than watching the shadows. But their numbers are high. Anna traced the line of the wall on the map. We avoid the main gates entirely. We do not fight Unsullied unless we have no other choice. If the Sellswords are undisciplined, they are our weak point. What of the news in the city? What did the taverns tell you? Castle let out a heavy breath, sharing a grim look with Alan. The entire city is vibrating with terror, Castle reported, his voice dropping. Khal Drogo and his Khalasar have been sighted on the flatlands. They are massive. The horde arrives in exactly 2 days. The air in the cabin grew incredibly cold. 2 days, John repeated quietly. The margin for error had just evaporated entirely. The Magisters are bleeding their treasuries dry to pay the Khal off, hoping he takes their gifts and rides past the city walls, Alan explained. Magister Illyrio expects Khal Drogo at his gates at dawn the day after tomorrow. Viserys Targaryen is preparing, Castle finished the thought, his face dark with disgust. They intend to finalize the marriage pact before the sun reaches its peak. Arthur sat back in his chair, rubbing his bearded jaw. If the girl is given to the Khal, once she is surrounded by 40,000 screamers, a rescue becomes entirely impossible. Even a shadow cannot walk through a sea of horses unnoticed. Then we do not wait for the horses, John said, his voice hard as iron. We strike tomorrow night, the eve of their arrival. Arya frowned, leaning forward from her crate. Wouldn't it be safer to strike tonight? Why wait another day? Tonight, the guards are restless and alert with the news of the approaching horde. Arthur corrected, his veteran mind seeing the clear advantage. Tomorrow, the entire manse will spend the day preparing for the Khal's arrival. By tomorrow night, the servants and the Sellswords will be exhausted. We strike in the deepest hour of the dark, when the house is entirely asleep. John nodded. The Unsullied will remain at the front gates. The rear of the manse will be lightly held. The Sellswords will be fighting sleep, not watching the dark walls. John pointed to the back edge of the manse on the map, where the high brick wall bordered a narrow, twisting alleyway. I will go over the wall here, John stated. Castle said the top of the wall is lined with broken glass, Arya pointed out. You'll slice your hands to ribbons trying to pull yourself up. I won't touch the top of the wall, John said simply. The force will carry me over. I will land in the gardens. I can hide my presence from the Sellswords and slip into the main house. Arthur leaned over the table, his mind searching for the flaws. The manse is enormous, John. Could have 50 rooms. How will you find the girl in the dark before a servant stumbles upon you? She is Targaryen, John said quietly. She carries the blood of old Valyria. I have spent years training my senses to feel the subtle currents of the living world. The blood of the dragon will not feel like the blood of a Pentoshi servant or a hired Sellsword. It will feel like fire. Same like Rhaenys. I will find her. And once you have her? Anna asked, her gaze fixed entirely on her nephew. You cannot simply walk out the front door with a hostage. I will bring her back to the rear wall, John explained, tracing the route with his finger. I will drop her down to you. We return to the lower docks, board the ship, and sail before the sun comes up. Arthur stared at the map. He mapped the distances, the guard rotations, and the absolute, unforgiving reality of what they were attempting. It was a precise strike. It relied entirely on John's mastery of the force and the arrogance of the Pentoshi guards. It is a sound plan, Arthur concluded, his voice heavy with responsibility. Anna, Arya, and I will wait in the shadows of the rear alleyway. If you are spotted, John, if the alarms are raised, Anna and I will breach the rear gate. We will draw the Sellswords to us and make as much noise as possible. You use the distraction to get the girl over the wall and run for the docks. We will hold the line. Arya's eyes widened slightly. She understood what Arthur was truly saying. If things went wrong, Arthur Dayne and Anna Stark would stand their ground against overwhelming numbers to buy John the time to escape. They would not run. They would fight until they were overwhelmed. It won't come to that, Jon promised, his gray eyes meeting Arthur's. I am a shadow. There is one final complication we have not addressed, Arthur said, the pragmatism in his voice cutting through the tension. He looked at Jon, then at Anna. The girl herself. Jon frowned. What about her? We are treating her like a sack of grain we simply need to carry over a wall, Arthur explained. But she is a 17-year-old girl, and she will not come with you willingly. Arya scoffed softly. Why wouldn't she? We are saving her from being sold to a Dothraki warlord. She should be thanking us on her knees. A child's reasoning, Arya, Arthur corrected her firmly, his tone allowing no argument. You view us as her saviors because you know our intentions. Daenerys Targaryen does not. Arthur placed his hands flat on the table, leaning in so the grim reality of the situation was perfectly clear to all of them. Her brother has spent her entire life filling her head with poison. He has told her that Westerosi assassins hide in every shadow, paid by King Robert to slit her throat in the dark. She has been hunted, starved, and terrified her whole life. Anna nodded slowly. Arthur is right. To her, we are not noble knights. We are the monsters from her brother's stories. We are the agents of the usurper. Picture it from her perspective, Arthur continued, looking directly at Jon. She is sitting alone in her bedchamber in the dead of night. A stranger dressed in dark leather, carrying a castle-forged blade, drops silently into her room. You do not look like a savior, Jon. You look exactly like the assassin she has been waiting for her entire life. Jon's jaw tightened as the harsh truth settled over him. If I try to explain who I am, or why I am there, she won't listen, Anna finished bluntly. She will be consumed by absolute, blinding panic. The moment she sees you, she will scream. And the moment she screams, every unsullied and Sel's word in the manse will swarm the room. You will be trapped, and the mission will fail. Silence fell over the cabin. The sound of the water lapping against the hull seemed exceptionally loud. Arya looked between the three veteran warriors, her youthful certainty deeply shaken. Then how do we prove we are there to help her? We don't, Jon said quietly. Jon stood up straight, his face an unreadable mask of northern pragmatism. He had been raised by Eddard Stark. He had been taught that the survival of the pack, the survival of the innocent, often required cold, brutal decisions. You did not risk the mission to preserve your own sense of honor. Time is our enemy inside that manse, Jon stated, his voice completely devoid of hesitation. We cannot spend 10 minutes in an enemy stronghold trying to convince a terrified hostage to trust a stranger. If a scream kills us, then I do not give her the chance to scream. Arthur watched the young man closely, waiting for the conclusion. I will find her chamber, Jon continued, his eyes cold and focused. I will slip in silently. Before she can see me, before she can draw breath to call for the guards, I will strike the side of her neck. It will stop the blood flow to her head for a fraction of a second. She will be unconscious before she hits the floor. Arya stared at her brother, shocked by the sheer, calculated ruthlessness of the plan. You're going to knock her out? I am going to keep her alive, Jon corrected firmly. I will carry her unconscious over the wall and bring her to the ship. She can wake up when we are halfway across the narrow sea, surrounded by open water. She can hate us, she can scream, and she can curse us all she wants when it is safe to do so. But tomorrow night, she sleeps. Arthur Dayne gave a slow, solemn nod of respect. It was not the gallant, heroic rescue a singer would write a song about. It was dark, it was harsh, and it was undeniably brutal. But it was exactly the kind of flawless, pragmatic logic that kept men alive in the real world. It is the only way, Anna agreed, her voice hard. We do not risk our lives for the sake of polite conversation. You silence her, you take her, and you vanish. The plan is set, Arthur declared, standing up from his chair. He looked at Castle and Alan. Return to the crew. Tell the captain to keep the ship completely dark tomorrow night. The moorings are to be untied, held only by a single slipknot. The moment we step onto this deck with the girl, we cast off. Yes, sir? The two wolf guards replied, bowing quickly before slipping out of the cabin. Arthur turned back to the Starks. We rest now, eat a heavy meal, drink water, and sleep. We do not leave this cabin until the sun sets tomorrow. When the manse is at its quietest, we move. The following day was an agonizing exercise in discipline. The heat of Pentos baked the wooden hull of the ship, making the small cabin stiflingly warm. They did not open the portholes. They ate dried meat and hard cheese in silence. Arya spent the hours pacing the small length of the floor, the adrenaline already beginning to hum in her veins. She had thought stealth was a grand adventure, but the cold, clinical way her family planned a kidnapping had sobered her considerably. This was not a game. Jon sat in the corner, his eyes closed. He spent the entire day immersed in the Force, gathering his strength. He slowed his heartbeat, regulating his breathing until he seemed more like a carved stone statue than a living boy. He was packing his energy tightly into his core, preparing his muscles for the explosive, silent demands of the night to come. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the smog-filled sky over Pentos in bruised shades of purple and deep red, Arthur Dayne stood up. He wrapped Dawn tightly in a thick leather sheath, slinging it across his back. He pulled his dark brown cloak over his shoulders. "It is time," Arthur said quietly. Anna pulled her gray hood up, obscuring her auburn hair. She handed Arya a dark wool scarf. "Wrap your face. Keep your eyes lowered. If a city guard stops us in the streets, you act like a terrified beggar child. You do not speak." Arya nodded tightly, wrapping the dark wool around her lower face. Jon opened his eyes. The gray irises were sharp, clear, and entirely devoid of fear. He stood up, pulling his black leather gloves tight. They left the cabin, stepping out onto the deck. The crew of the Winter's Lance was completely silent, standing at their stations in the dark, ready for the immediate escape. The four Northerners walked down the gangplank and stepped into the filthy, chaotic shadows of the lower docks. They moved swiftly, blending seamlessly into the crowds of drunken sailors, tired slaves, and shouting merchants. They left the docks behind, climbing the winding, steep cobblestone streets toward the upper city. The air grew cleaner, the smells of sewage replaced by the scent of night-blooming flowers and expensive incense. As they neared the top of the hill, the city grew completely silent. The glow of a few sparse lanterns illuminated the high walls ahead. Arthur held up a hand, pulling them into the deep shadows of a narrow, brick-lined alleyway. At the end of the alley stood the towering, 15-foot brick wall of the manse. Through the darkness, they could see the jagged, cruel shards of broken glass glittering in the mortar at the very top. There was no shouting, no music. The manse was deep in slumber. The Sellswords guarding the outer gardens were likely leaning against the stone, fighting their own heavy eyelids. "The wall is clear," Anna whispered, her hand resting on her sword hilt. Arthur looked at Jon. "We hold the alley. You have the wind, Jon. Bring her out." Jon did not offer a boastful reply. He simply pulled his hood up over his head. He stepped out of the shadows and walked silently toward the towering brick wall, ready to become the ghost his father had trained him to be.